Started. Welcome. Um, First, I'll just share a bit of background. My name is Kirsten Scott, and I'm part of the Mission and Justice team. And first, I'll just share a bit of background about what brings us to featuring our guest today. Mission and Justice has begun work on developing a land use acknowledgement statement for our congregation. And ARLA, our anti-racism learning and advocacy group, recently hosted the showing of the Doctrine of Discovery film. And so today we continue on that with wanting to enhance Bethel community's understanding of Native American history and culture and our relationship to their story, both past and present. So we begin today in welcoming Reverend Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. And she is a proud member of the Oglala Sioux Nation, who, in honoring her ancestral legacy, wears many hats in serving her community. She teaches through an indigenous lens about healing and inclusivity in the eyes of our Creator, often through storytelling. Currently, she teaches at Augsburg College, serves as Minister of Social Justice and Advocacy for CYF Ministries at Nativity Lutheran Church in St. Anthony, Minnesota, and speaks with congregations throughout the ALCA as well. So please allow for an openness within your heart and mind as you listen today. And let's extend a warm welcome to Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
Good morning. I'm going to take a drink here. I was saying I don't drink coffee, but I lived in England for 7 years and become very accustomed to my tea and a slight tea snob. So, but if I don't have my tea, my son knows, get me my tea in the morning or I'm cranky. So thank you for the introduction. So as she said, my name is Kelly Sherman-Conroy. My Lakota name is Mato Washde Winyan, which means good bear woman. In the customs within my tribe, so I'm from the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe, and you're going to hear me kind of reference a couple. You're going to hear me say Lakota and Dakota. And there's actually a Nakota, and the difference is a dialect. So it actually just tells us geographically where we are from, but we are all under the Sioux Nation. And so kind of the same, like if you were a Minnesotan accent, maybe Texas, maybe Boston, right? We can kind of tell through the accents and things, and some of that was with us as well, within my larger tribe. So I am from the Lakota, the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe, so that means we were kind of more west, so South Dakota. I come from Pine Ridge, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is southwest in South Dakota, so drive all the way through that beautiful, boring countryside to get to where I'm from. But I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the history that I'm connected to here. So I'm going to explain a couple of things as well. Is often, now when I talk, I'm going to talk about what I know, my wisdom, my knowledge that has come through my family. So in North America, we have over 542 native tribes. That means that there are different languages, different beliefs and thoughts and philosophy, right, and all of that, and spirituality. And so I speak on my knowledge as a Sioux person, as a Lakota person. So I do not and cannot say that I can speak for everybody, but what I am going to teach is kind of, I always say I have my friend Joe Davis, he's a spoken word poet, and he always does these poetry drops, so I said I'd drop a little Lakota spirituality drop today. So when it comes to time and how we describe our family, as most indigenous people are this way, so I want to show a picture here. Will it work? Really? I see it. Maybe I have to do this. Hold on. There's always technical problems. This way in my classroom. Okay. Why is it not changing? Well, you may not get to see anything. What's going on here? There we go. Okay. But the way that we often talk about our indigenous family, right? Our Tioshpae, which is our family, we grow up as telling stories. So for the Lakota people and most indigenous people, we are a people of story. You know, we didn't have buildings and those kind of things that tended through time. We had stories. And as Christians, we can kind of relate to that as well, right? Is because we are a people of story. Christ taught us through story. That is how we learned who we are as a community of God, is through story. Right? So there's that kind of connection in that way. So you'll hear me talk about my grandmother, but you'll also hear me, but it will mean either my grandmother that just passed, in the last 15 years, or my 3 times great-grandmother who was imprisoned at the prison camp in Fort Snelling. That was in Fort Snelling, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But this is some of my family. So this is my mother, Joanne, who is a pastor. Here in the Twin Cities. Actually, my father, Gerald, who lives in, he's a retired rancher and banker, and he always says that he grew up being able to play cowboys and Indians by himself because he, grew up on the ranch. But he lives in Red Lodge, Montana on a ranch. This is my oldest brother. I come from a family of 7. So I have my parents, my dad was married a couple of times after, so we have a large family. But my older brother is here in the Twin Cities, so a lot of you have probably, I've heard, gone to his restaurant at Owamini. And so he equally does some work on reintroducing in the reclamation of knowledge of indigenous knowledge. So his is through food and plant systems. But on the far right-hand side, you see is my great-great-grandfather, John. My grandfather, John, sometimes like my son will talk about his grandpa John, and you would never guess until you really listen that he's talking about his grandpa John here, who fought in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And see, that tells you about how we learn to be connected to our family, so that when we hear those stories, that we have this understanding, that I grew up with this understanding of how connected we are to what we say sometimes as ancestors, right? But it's when we talk about them, we know that they are always present with us. And so that distance kind of goes away because we are so intricately connected. And so when we talk about cultural trauma, like generational trauma and things that indigenous people experience, that's kind of a small bit of an understanding of why rehashing and talking about a lot of this tragic history, how it pulls into that generational trauma, because we carry it with us because of how we understand our connection to our family and how connected we are. And so this is my family. And so this is my aunt, this is my grandmother here, and my uncle, who's right in the center here. So they were a part of the Santee Dakota people who were exiled out of the state of Minnesota. So the land that your church is on, the land that you are on, is Dakota land. And so when we say that, is that this is their home. This is the place, this is their birthplace, right? So the Dakota people are indigenous to this land. Now we do have, and we have a beautiful community in the Twin Cities of one of the largest urban Indian populations, right? And we also see in history that we have the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, that moved in as well. We have Ho-Chunk, so we have various other tribes, but when we talk about this land that you are on, this is Dakota land, okay? And this was the homeland of my grandparents and my family. My great-great-great-grandmother and my uncle were when my grandmother was just about 19, 20 years old, she was imprisoned in the boarding, or in the prison camp at Fort Snelling. Her brother and my grandfather, who is not in this photo, were both, along with a lot of her other family members, they were imprisoned in Mankato as part of the 300 men after the U.S.-Dakota War. It didn't matter if you were innocent or not, and they rounded up 300 Native men. They weren't all Dakota. They rounded them up, and they had trials. Their trials lasted for about 4 minutes, and all were made guilty, right? My uncle remained in prison. He was not a part of the 38 that were hung, but their cousins were, so the husband of my aunts here and some others were a part of that, the hanging in Mankato. My uncle was continued after the hanging of the Dakota 38, as they call it, was then sent down into Iowa to a prison camp there for almost 3 years. So he remained in prison for quite some time. My grandmother, on the other hand, her story is a little bit different. I'm going to skip past. So this is what the prison camp looks like. You can see this when you go down to Fort Snelling. It's just right on the river, right? And you see what they did was they had erected these huge, really tall wooden structures that went all the way around in a 2-mile radius. So over 1,700 women, children, and elderly were imprisoned here, mostly were imprisoned here. This spot particular was a very sacred spot for the Dakota people because this spot was the home of their creation story. This was where the birth of the Dakota people, their story begins, was here. And so what that meant was when my grandmother was born, when my uncle and my relatives, they would come from, the women would walk miles and miles and miles just to get to this spot to give birth. It was a sacred spot for the Dakota people, and it was turned into a prison camp. My grandmother's role was a healer, was that of a healer. And when I was little, and all the women in my family in generations are known as healers in our family, and I liken it a little bit to the idea of pastoral care. So she was really a healer of like the whole body, so mind and soul and body, right? And when I was young, I remember my grandfather had given me my name, and then the Bear Clan in my tribe is a representation of bears are comforters, are healers. And so I remember my grandfather telling me that I was going to be a healer when I grew up, and I remember thinking, oh, no way, because I didn't like the sight of blood. I thought, there's no way. I didn't like science, you know. So I worried for a long time what that meant, because I honestly thought when he told me that I was going to be a doctor of physical healing in that way, and I can't do that. And my mother and I started a New Start Mission Church in Rapid City, South Dakota, in the ELCA, and it's called Woyatan Lutheran Church, and it's still there. And my job was to just kind of go door to door, right? And we had nobody, so we had a church building, but we had absolutely no people. And so my job, I went door to door trying to build a youth group and children, right, and try to find people. And eventually, our church, we got this invitation to go to this prison that was in and around Rapid City, and they had a work release program. And they had about 80% of the people within that prison system were Native Americans. And often they were asking for people to come, Bible study, to pray, just to talk to. So my mom and a couple of people from our congregation started going. We were an extremely small congregation. And then as we continued this relationship, the prison let us bus these pretty much all young men to the church. So every Saturday we would have this worship service, and we would bus these prisoners to the church. Then their families started coming. And that was actually how we started our ministry, was we started ministering to the families and not only just the men. And so it was kind of a fun experience in some ways, because my mom's a very tiny person, and she'd be standing up there doing communion, and this big, tall, tattooed guy would be standing next to her serving, right? And then the other half of our congregation were homeless. So we ended up having I'd say we'd worship about 200 or so, but they literally were, the families of the prisoners and homeless. And they would come, and the only thing my mom would say would be that you had to come sober, right? And my job was not only teaching children and youth, but I was on snuggle patrol, because, the prisoners didn't get to see their families too often, or their girlfriends, so I got to kind of, yeah. But what it did was it showed us it was just a beautiful community. But we began to, what Mom was doing, what we were doing was bringing in the spirituality that we knew as Indigenous people. My mom and I, we both grew up very traditional as well. And so we would bring these elements into our worship. And so we started getting more and more Native people into our congregation. And we started to minister to what they needed, right? So the homeless that we had coming was that there was a creek that flowed through the town of Rapid City. That's where a lot of the homeless would reside. So we would go down there, and we would twice a week, and we would be making sandwiches and serve them out of the back of my car, and soup and things like that. And they just started coming. We'd say, if you want more, if you want to be a part of community. So everybody was welcomed. And pretty soon, other Indigenous people, Native people from the area started coming. And there was this gentleman that would come. And he was an elder of my tribe, and he was very traditional. He was not Christian. But he came to worship every week. And one day he walked in, and he asked if my mom was there, and I said, no, she's not there. I said, but let me make you something to eat. So he said, okay, and nobody was in the church, just the two of us, and so we went back to the kitchen, and I'm digging around and created a sandwich and made some coffee, and he sat down and he ate, and I made some extras for him to take, and he said, he turned to me, and this was the first time he spoke to me directly ever, and he said, I know why you're going to be a healer. And I remember looking at him thinking, I don't know and he said, you're going to bring people to Christ. And I was in my early 20s at the time, and I had never, this was not a conversation that my mother and I had ever said. We'd never said that my grandfather about this conversation. He had known my grandparents at the time. And it just kind of blew me away. So he left, and I remember going to my mom when she came, and I told her what happened, and her mouth just dropped, right? But he put it into perspective. He put my life, that event, I finally got it about, you go to seminary and they always tell you, you have to start talking about who you are and what your call to ministry is, right? But during my dissertation, it finally hit me that where I was living, that the history, that who I was connected to here, all of that just came to this head, that I realized finally really what that meant, what this traditional Lakota elder meant by bringing people to Christ. A lot of my work that I do is in healing, and so I'm trained in somatic healing, right? But is trauma and healing. And my hope is through my work, I've had some amazing Native theologians before me, so Vine Deloria, George Tinker, and they do this amazing job at naming the hurt of Indigenous people of this land, right? And the atrocities that happened. And then you have people like Stephen Charleston or Randy Woodley, and what they have done now has said, okay, here's that trauma, but here's how we see God in the world as Indigenous people. And these are some amazing men before me, and then there's me. And my job has now been, they've named it, they've kind of began to reclaim, right, a little bit of how we see the world, but my job now is to bring that healing, so people like me who are Christian, Indigenous Christians, that we can have this conversation and understand who we fully are as God, right? So, or as God in us. And so when I was little, I grew up on the back 60 of my grandfather's ranch. And there's a homestead right in the center. And about a quarter of a mile down this little hill was my uncle and his family. And we were about 2.5 miles up on this big tall hill. And then about a mile from us was my other uncle, right? And then about 5-6 miles on either side of us were two villages. And my grandfather, often I found myself hanging out with the elders in my family, because I had my brother and my cousins, and they were all boys, and if I didn't want to get locked in the barn or stuck on top of a haystack, I was with my grandparents. And they lived on this land that was called, they call it the Sand Hills, and it bordered the South Dakota-Nebraska border, right? And rightfully so, it was built by my great-grandfather and my grandpa, but you couldn't farm on that land because most indigenous people were put on lands that nobody else really wanted. So it was hard to cultivate on that land or to grow things and things like that. So my grandfather became a rancher, but it had like this really tall, beautiful golden green grass kind of. And one day, I think I was about 6 or 7, my grandmother woke me up because my mom had brought me down. And she said, help me make some breakfast for your grandfather. So I was up in the kitchen with my grandma, as I always was, and I was cooking breakfast for my grandfather, who was out, and he would go out at like 4 o'clock in the morning to start feeding the horses and the cows and bring them in and do all that stuff, and come in about 7 or 8 and have some breakfast and then go back out again. So we were making breakfast, and my grandfather drives up, and so my grandmother says, well, run out and grab him some coffee. So I go out and I grab him some coffee and I take it to him, and he takes a sip, and it's kind of like these are some of my favorite kind of mugs. They're a little bit bigger, but they're the really thick ones that you'd find in cafes and things like that. And so I gave him some coffee, and we were standing outside, and he said, come with me. So I walked with him, and we stopped at this sprout that was right in the middle of the road, right in the middle of the dirt road. And it was pretty tall. And we stood there. My grandfather wasn't saying anything, so I thought, okay. And we moved to the next one, go to the next one, and again, he's not saying anything. And he continued to do this. So I thought, this is one of those moments, right? The elders often came to the ranch. They would walk those 5 or 6 miles, because sometimes they didn't have cars. And they would walk, these elders, and they were much older, of course, than I was, and they taught me a lot, but oftentimes because they chose to only speak in Lakota, that I didn't quite understand that language quite yet, so they taught me through their actions and stuff, and so I realized that this was one of those moments my grandfather was going to teach me. So I'm walking with him, and he's stopping at each one of these sprouts, and eventually we go through the wooden corrals, and there are these wooden fences and this one-level red barn, and there were some horses in there, and we had gone through the chickens, and we're kind of crawling through, and we're getting up, and on the back of that was this beautiful kind of hill. So my grandfather and I walked up on that hill, and we turn around, and he sits down. So I remember sitting next to him, and my grandfather reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out a piece of candy. And for me, my grandfather always had some sort of candy or something on him, right? So whenever we would travel, if it were 2 or 3 towns, and even if it was like an hour to get to where we had to stop in every town and get something to eat or a snack. It drove my grandma and my mom crazy. So there was always something. So my grandfather hands me this candy, and we just sit there, and he's not saying anything. But I could just smell it still, right? That grass, we were sitting in the midst of this tall grass, and it had just rained. You know, it's like when it rains, and I think grass smells so beautiful after it rains, and you could just smell it, and the manure. But you could sit there, and then you heard like this little bee or little bug buzzing past my ear, and then there were these birds, and they were fighting, and they were kind of flying around. And you could hear like the horses, they were stomping their feet, and they were wisping their tails because there were horse flies at that time, and it was really bad, and they were bothering the horses. And all this life was just going on. And we sat there, and it's one of my most beautiful memories with my grandfather, just sitting there, because we often did this. But that day was so different, and he gets up, and he walks, and he says, it's time to go. We're going to go this way. And we start walking to this tree line, and my grandfather says, you choose where we go in here. So, okay, because often my grandfather didn't choose to play with me, so I was really excited. And they had these tree lines, and it was really long, and this was like my forest. And if you drive around anywhere in probably farm and ranch country, anywhere around here, right, you see these tree lines, and they're usually created to help protect from the harsh elements per se, right? So I walk him to this tree, and there's this big, huge tree in the middle of this long tree line. I mean, it was pretty big. And this huge tree, and it was really round, but at the base of the tree, it indented in, and you could sit in it, and it was like my spot. And if you sat in it, it's like it hugged you. Like, I really was a tree hugger. But it would hug you. And I was so excited, and I told my grandfather, okay, it's like, this is where I want to go. And we're sitting there, and then he said, well, why did you choose this spot? And I said, well, and I remember telling him, this is my friend, and blah, 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 this is where I go when my cousins are mean. And I was so excited, and I'm talking and talking as a kid would, and then my grandfather looks at me, and he says, we're going to have to cut your tree down. And I started screaming and crying and yelling, and I took off, and I started running to my grandparents' house. By the time I got there, because there was a bit of a distance, my grandfather is coming, and my grandmother is standing on the back steps with her arms folded, and she's watching me. And I run past her, and you could hear me open that door, and they had one of those wooden screen doors, and it slammed really hard. And then in their house, like, my grandfather and his dad built the house, and it would always creak. Like, it had these creaky floors, which was sometimes the best part, but I ran so fast you didn't even hear the creaks. And I got to their bed, and I remember I'm crying and crying. And my grandmother comes in eventually, and but before she did, I heard her go, Dad, what did you do? And you see my grandfather. There were 3 ways to tell how my grandmother felt about my grandfather at one point in time. So if she called him grandpa or pa, that meant he's good, which is what I heard most of my life. If you heard dad, that usually meant lovingly, she's still all right, but a little annoyed. And then if you heard Tom, he was in trouble. So I knew she was annoyed, right? And unless it was outside of, right, when we were in public, people, of course, called him Tom. And eventually she comes in and she says, you need to go talk to your grandpa. Think of a little pigtailed, brown-haired little 6-year-old walking out there, and I was ready to be mad. She had to convince me to go out there, and I was so mad at my grandpa. And I remember going and stomping through the house, and I go out the door, and you could hear it slap shut, and my grandfather is standing there. And at this point, the sun was out, and my grandfather was standing there, and he had baggy Wranglers on and his work boots, and he had a red flannel with a Wrangler shirt, and he wore this cowboy hat. And the cowboy hat was like one of those, for those of you old enough, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Robert Redford, Paul Newman, wore those really cool hats, right? And they'd often kind of tilt them a little bit. That was my grandfather, except for his had like a really gross sweat ring around it because he wore it so much. And he was standing there, and he had this short silver hair, right? And the sun hit him just right, and just as I was going to look up and be really mad at him, the sun hit him just right, and he had silver eyes. So he had these gray eyes, and I couldn't be mad at him because standing in front of me was just this majestic, amazing person in my life. So I'm trying so hard to be mad at him, and I'm standing there, and he says, come with me. And we walk to the first plant, or the first tree sprout, and he says, what do you see? And I'm still trying to be mad, and he says, Kelly, what do you see? And I said, well, this is my friend, and these are, and I started, and he, looked out onto everything, and I started explaining and naming The horses had names. I had named all the chickens. The trees had names. There were spots where there were water on our ranch, and feeding troughs, all of it. I was naming it, giving him all the names, and I stood there for a long time, I'm pretty sure, and he was quiet. But the way I described this was my family. And not one moment during that time or ever growing up did my grandfather or anybody correct me on how I saw the world. Because I saw the world and understood it as family. We have this word or this phrase in Lakota, or you hear it in Dakota, Simatakue Awasi, which means we are all related. And there was that understanding of that at a very young age. You see, the way I grew up understanding the world was that the Spirit resides in and amongst everything. The birds, the bees, the trees, the animals, us. The Holy Spirit resides in everything. And because of that, often we as Christians and we as people tend to place ourselves above the rest of creation. We're taught that at the very beginning in Genesis. We are placed because we begin as humans, right? They begin naming, they begin giving names and doing all these things, but we're automatically placed this way, right? That we place ourselves above creation. But Indigenous people, my Lakota people, we have this knowledge that we don't see the world this way. We see it in a circle because we understand how that Spirit resides in and amongst everything, that is how we are connected. So that that your troubles are my troubles, my celebrations are your celebrations, right? That there is this understanding of how we are family. And that is how my grandparents and my elders taught me how to see the world and understand it to this day. That's how my son is taught to understand how we live in this world. So what my grandfather was doing that day was he wasn't just going to go and pull these sprouts up. The first time we went around, he was going and he was quietly praying and talking to each one of these sprouts and these things that had to change on the ranch. Because he understood that if they were to grow, they would disrupt the land. So you couldn't have a tree growing in the middle of the road, or you would have to drive around it and it'd cause problems. So what he and my great-grandfather had been doing to create that tree line was when these sprouts began to grow, they would go and they would pray and they would thank them. They would dig them up and they would move them into the tree line so that the tree line was continuously growing. And so my grandfather pulls out this handkerchief with tobacco, had some sage in it, and he said, why don't you pray? So at each one of these, we went back again, and I stood there, and I talked to them, and I gave them names, and I prayed. And then we got to my tree. And when you're little, you don't know these things, but the tree itself actually was quite old, and it was rotting, and so it was going to fall, and it was dangerous, and he actually knew I played there. So it had to come down for a lot of reasons. But it tells you how spoiled I was, because my grandfather took a lot of the wood and made me a tree house, which my brother was no longer allowed in growing up. But it was that, what my grandfather taught me that day, and what I understood for the rest of my life was how I walk in prayer daily. That the actions and how I see the world, how important that is, and how we treat everything around us. See, this knowledge, I'll see if I can get, we have a different guy. So this knowledge that my elders, my grandparents were teaching me was the same thing that my grandmother knew, that my uncle, my grandfather, right? They knew this. That when by this point in time, was no longer they were able to speak in their own language. It was made illegal. That the beliefs and their spirituality, they couldn't practice. They couldn't practice openly and talk about it. They couldn't dress how they wanted to dress because it was all illegal. The history of the United States, and this is a prime example, was what they call a cultural genocide, right? Meaning that the boarding school systems, a lot of you know about, right? So the boarding schools and the philosophy of the U.S. government really was to save the Indian and kill the Indian and save the man, which meant everything about who we are, we could no longer be. So all of that knowledge and that wisdom, they wanted to erase because they didn't take the time to actually get to know people like my grandmother and to understand that the knowledge that we carry as Indigenous people isn't actually all that scary. And that when you hear our stories, we don't have to compare and show you in the Bible where you could find something like it, because you hear God in the story already. And that's the beauty of who we are as this family of God, right? Is that God creates us. We are created to be community. It's this when we are born, right? So we are born, we know that the world is made of water, right? That we are people that are made of water. When we are born and when we are growing in our mother's wombs, we are in that water. Scientifically, water holds memory. So we know that water is life. But God is like this cool God, because God made us in this way that water, because it holds memory, it flows throughout the world, it holds story. So when we are growing in our mother's womb, those stories that are within that water become a part of who we are. So your stories become a part of my story. The stories of my grandparents become a part of who I am. And then we're born, and that water flows back out into the world and becomes a part of the story again. And it adds it into it. And then we're baptized, right? And we're not only baptized into this community of God, into this family of God, but we are becoming reunited with that story. And those people who are present, their stories become a part of ours as we share through that water. And so it's that kind of knowledge and that understanding of how we are in the world and how we are meant to not look at each other or the world this way, but that we are fully all a part of creation. So this history of my grandmother after she was exiled, right? They were loaded up onto barges and riverboats. They were sent down into Missouri, then up into what was called Crow Creek in the middle of South Dakota. It's still there today. It's now the Crow Creek Indian Reservation, but it was made specifically for the Santee Sioux people. When they were here, they were 1,700. By the time they got to Crow Creek, they were 1,300 people. They lost that many. Within the first year of living at Crow Creek, they lost the majority of their children. They lost over 300 people. Crow Creek was not the best place if you've driven through South Dakota. Quite boring and just there's nothing. I mean, there really isn't. A lot of hunting if you like birds, but there really is nothing, right, in that sense. And so they struggled to live in Crow Creek. That missionaries had to help them and to talk with the U.S. government, and after almost 3 years, they finally decided this is a horrible place, and it must be if the government finally says it's bad. So they move them to where is Santee and Niobrara, Nebraska. So on the border of South Dakota, Nebraska. And I wish it would change, because what you would see, and it's just not going to happen, what you would see would be a picture of the story didn't end as a tragedy. You could see it that way. But the way I see it was my grandmother learned the women of their tribe had to rebuild themselves. They learned how to make houses, right? So they made lodges, they made church, they made a church, they made a school, and it's probably my computer, I don't know, but It changes on here, just not. Oh, there we go. Look at that. So this was the house that she built, right? So they learned how to do all this kind of stuff. The star quilts that you see, the Santee women learned how to sew and make their clothes in these quilts. And there's all these stories of this resilience, that all this knowledge that I just shared with you, if it weren't for the strength and the resilience of my grandmother and holding on to those and finding ways to share her story, I wouldn't be standing here as like the first Native woman theologian in the ELCA, or that when I got my doctorate, I literally stood 2 miles from where she was imprisoned. I don't know what she would think. I often kind of wonder, what would she think about what I became? Because the one thing people often do is like, well, how can you be a Christian and how can you be a Native person? Knowing especially the trauma that endured, right? And my grandmother, the one thing that I was always made known at a young age was this. You see, my grandmother and her people, they understood the message when the missionaries came through. They understood the stories about Christ and what he was teaching. They understood it because they were already living a Christ-like life. Their wisdom and knowledge predated Christianity, so they got it. It carried through generations. So they knew that the Word of God, that Christ was not what was causing all this trauma and this pain. It was the messengers, not the message. So that was something that I learned at a very young age, to understand that who I am, I don't have to one day be a Christian and one day be a Native person. That the all full of who I am and how God created me to be was exactly how God intended. That the spirituality, the wisdom we carried, and the thoughts and the philosophy of my Lakota Dakota people, that was just God speaking to us in a way that we could understand. Think Pentecost. God spoke to people in their own language. That's exactly what happened and what happens with us as Indigenous people. So when we talk about, and I'm almost done here, so when we talk about, as you move forward and looking at land acknowledgements and things like that, or what you can do, remember these stories, right? One of my confirmation students, I don't like land acknowledgements so much sometimes because they make it sound like we're not here, that we once walked this land. Like, yeah, I'm still here. And one of my confirmation students one time said, I think I got it. I think I understand why you don't like land acknowledgements. And I thought, oh, okay. 7th grade, tell me what you think, right? And he says, it's like the Lord's Prayer. And I remember going, oh no. I mean, this is going to be really good, or I'm going to be really in trouble with parents. And he said, it's like the Lord's Prayer. We say the Lord's Prayer when we're in worship, but then we move on. And we know that it's sacred, and we know that those words are important. What it's asking us to do is important. But do we really get it? Like, do we really do anything? He said, and I think that's what you're saying about land acknowledgements. We know those words are sacred, that we want people to do something and to understand this, but they just become words that get recited. Some of this is my words, that get recited before a meeting, before worship, before whatever. And I went, wow, he got it, 7th grade, that's awesome. Just shows you how well I am as a teacher. No, but he got it. A 7th grader got it. That when you look at a land acknowledgement, think of it as a form of activism. Which means when somebody reads that land acknowledgement, how are you motivating people to do something? That overall effect, right? But then, how are you educating people? So not just saying, I once lived this, I once walked these lands, or whomever, but teach them, who are some of the people, Indigenous leaders that are in your area that are present, that are doing something. So name a little bit of that history, but also bring in the present, right? And then the action part comes, which is, what are you doing? Now the beauty about land acknowledgements is you can post your land acknowledgement on your website or wherever, but you can change it in life as you are moving. It doesn't have to stay the same. Church, a congregation I'm working with in the Twin Cities, each Sunday the pastor says a little bit something different, right? But they're showing you what they're doing on their website. And they're showing you, like, here are some of the resources we used, but this is what we are doing. So they're showing you some action, and you're motivating the people. So learn the stories and understand the stories of a history that for 150 years, this history has been told one way, but listen to the others. And sit in the uncomfortable, but then move forward and do something, when you are learning. And I am done. Ooh. I am like really done because it's 10:35. It's like, I'm so sorry. But I'll be around afterwards to have conversations after worship. How's that? That work? Okay. See, I didn't look at my watch.